Thank you, Mr. Rue. I would now request Senior Research Analyst Wood Mackenzie, Mr. Rob Smith, on stage to deliver his presentation. Rob Smith joined Wood Mackenzie in 2015 as Senior Research Analyst, Copper Demand. In his role, Rob focuses on all aspects of the copper demand spectrum, covering usage trends in refined copper, direct use scrap, and downstream copper products. Rob has several years' experience analyzing the base metals markets. Prior to joining Wood Mackenzie, he worked at SNL Metals and Mining and Metals Consultancy, GFMS. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Smith.
So good afternoon, everyone. And I'd like to thank Sunil and the Metalex team very much for inviting me along to speak today. And it's a great privilege to be here in India speaking to you all. So in my role at Wood Mackenzie, I focus on the copper demand side, and today I'm going to talk through some of the key global trends and Indian demand prospects as we see them. So for those of you that don't know Wood Mackenzie, we are a global leader in providing research and consultancy to the metals and mining, oil, gas, power and chemical sectors, comprising of objective analysis on assets, companies and markets. As always, I would quickly like to point you to the disclaimer. Please take a moment to read this. The presentation is solely intended for attendees today and should not be disclosed outside of the conference. So just briefly looking through the agenda for today's presentation, I'm going to talk through global themes and trends in the copper market. I'll look at the China growth story and analyse some of the drivers that we've seen that have contributed to China's rise as a global copper superpower. And then we'll look through Indian copper demand, themes and trends, and how we see Indian demand playing out over the next few years. Sorry, just a bit slow there. So when we look at copper demand, we describe this as refined and direct use scrap used by semi-manufacturers, and this is around a 28 million tonne market globally. So what we can see on the chart on the left is a split by first use. As we can see there, wire rod accounts for around 62%, and then we have copper tube, around 10% going into plumbing tube, air conditioners, amongst other areas. And then we have other copper and alloy semis combined around 28% of global demand. And all these applications feed into a number of key end-use sectors, as we can see on the right. Construction around 31%, key applications there, building wire and plumbing tube. Electrical network infrastructure, you're looking at utility power cable, telecoms cable, and a whole range of other products such as transformers. In transport, we're looking at around 11% of demand. So this includes automobiles, perhaps the most important. We're also looking at shipbuilding, railways, and aerospace. Industrial machinery and equipment, in terms of general machinery and valves and fittings. And then we're looking at consumer and general products, around 24%, so that includes appliances, consumer electronics, defence, and a whole range of other areas. So there really is a huge range of applications that contribute to copper's demand profile. Now, if we look by region, how we see demand split on a first-use consumption basis, and there are a couple of key trends here that we see. The first is the decline in the more mature economies of North America and Europe that we've seen over the past decade and a half or so, and this is owed to substitution pressures in some sectors, plumbing, tube and telecommunications. It's also owed to the weak economic environment in those and weak IP, and it's also resulted from a shifting of manufacturing capacity away from these countries towards the Asian countries. Elsewhere, we can see steadiness in the sort of other Asia region, ex-China. This is owed to weakness in the Northeast Asian economies of Japan, South Korea and Taiwan being offset by strength in the Southeast Asian region. And then, as we can see, the big driver of demand is China. We see it grow around 12% per annum over the past decade and a half. Now accounts for around 45% of global consumption, up from around 15% in the year 2000. So this chart really shows, or matrix really shows the key drivers that we feel are important in driving copper demand. And what we see as we go through these is that China has had the bulk of these factors. So looking at the left-hand side, and what we can see there are the drivers of really internal or final use demand, strong economic growth, population growth, urbanisation, all key in driving demand across a host of end-use sectors, building, construction, electrical network infrastructure, demand for consumer goods and transport. And then we can see there also important is the copper intensity of the growth. So one aspect that we've seen in China, for instance, has been the usage in the power grid has been very copper intensive, tending to favour copper over aluminium within that country. And then, as we can see on the right, we feel that really to become a copper giant and to develop the manufacturing industry, both copper semis and downstream manufacturing, you need a whole host of components. Clearly, a competitive advantage in manufacturing, but also completeness in the supply chain is very important. And this is an area that China has done very well in terms of building out its capacity to produce from cathode through to final product and the creation of manufacturing hubs. And this has helped reduce logistics costs. Elsewhere, transportation infrastructure is very important in roads, rail and port infrastructure, again helping to reduce logistics costs and providing ease of access to final markets. Elsewhere, moving towards the bottom, and perhaps some of the advantages of a centrally planned economy has been the access to finance for state-owned enterprises, which have been a key factor driving consumption growth within China, and also limited red tape, which has led to the rapid development of its industrial sector. And finally, as we can see there at the bottom, favourable exchange rate and tariff regime is very important, and obviously this has been a factor that has held back Indian semi-sector over the past few years due to the inverse duty structure, and that's something that I'll talk about later on. So really the key point here is that there are a number of factors, interrelated factors, that drive both use from a final perspective and when we're looking at downstream manufacturing capacity and semis production capacity. So just looking at the themes now and comparing really India to what we've seen in China, and what we can see is that India has lagged behind China on a first use basis, and in our view this reflects a couple of key aspects. First, the sluggish rate of urbanisation in India compared to China. As we can see, China's urbanisation rate now up at about 56%, and that compares to India's rate of just over around 33%. Also, as we can see in the chart on the bottom, India's share of the manufacturing share of GDP within India is around about 17%, and this compares with significantly below China's rate of around 30%, and this is owed to the build out of the services sector within India, and also the continued focus on the agricultural sector as a source of employment, and these have restrained growth in Indian first-use consumption relative to China over recent years. Looking ahead though, we must say that the prospects for India are extremely bright. Looking at the chart on the left, what we can see is there is going to be tremendous growth in the working age population, and combined with the Make in India campaign and positive reforms such as the goods and services tax, we should see growth in the manufacturing sector increase going forward. Now, the urban population, obviously, as these workers move to cities to look for work, we should see a huge increase in the urban population over the coming years. And as I mentioned, this drives significant increases in copper consumption across a host of end-use sectors. One of the sectors expected to benefit is going to be construction. High single-digit growth expected in the construction sector in activity, and this should fuel demand for a host of applications, building wire, and also when we're looking further across the appliances sector as well, as these people kit out their homes with new appliances. Elsewhere, we're also expecting significant investment in the infrastructure sector, as we can see on the chart on the left, and has been discussed earlier throughout the day. India's per capita electricity consumption is significantly below a number of the developing and the mature economies. And we expect per capita electricity consumption to double by 2025 and triple by 2035. And this will drive demand for a host of applications: wire rod in power cable, winding wire, and strip within the transformer sector, amongst other areas. Now, if we look at the chart on the right, again, a similar theme. Per capita auto ownership very low in India compared with the developing and the developed economies. And we expect to see a sharp increase in auto sales and production over the next few years. Probably another aspect to consider here is also the growth of the electric vehicle market. Electric vehicles can be up to 2 to 3 times more copper intensive than the conventional auto. And we expect this will drive increased intensity of use within the auto sector over the coming years, although it must be said that this is from a low base, so probably something for the early 2020s to drive growth rather than today. So I think really, in summary, the prospects for end-use demand within India are very bright indeed. But I think probably the key question is how much perhaps semis producers within India will benefit from this uptick in end-use demand. And what we've seen is that a key theme over recent years has been the ramping up of semis imports, particularly wire rod from a number of ASEAN countries over recent years with a free trade deal and the inverse duty structure. And looking really across segments, we've seen that India ranks fairly highly in terms of net imports. So we can see it ranks in the top 5 in wire rod, in tube and pipe and plate, sheet, strip and foil product lines. And this does imply that there is some share that can potentially be clawed back for domestic semi-manufacturers. Aside from India, countries that appear frequently are China, Saudi Arabia in terms of imports, also the US and a number of European countries potentially providing some export opportunities going forward. So putting all this together, and where do we see Indian demand over the coming years? So the chart on the left effectively shows our estimate of total semis consumption. So this is the sum of domestic semis production plus net semis imports. And what we can really see there is that there is a growing share accounted for by this imported semis component. And this has constrained the growth in domestic semis production. Looking ahead, we do expect strong growth in end-use demand across a host of range of sort of end-use sectors. Infrastructure, construction, transport are expected to see significant growth, and this 7% that is there is significantly above the global average of around 2% that we expect over the next 5 years. So India really is going to be one of the countries, the bright spots for consumption going forward over the next few years. Within this, on the semi side, wire rod is expected to show strong growth. We're already seeing some capacity expansion announcements within the sector to take advantage of this increase in demand, although it should be said that semis imports as a proportion of the total will remain a large share. I would say that there are a number of upside risks to the semis production forecast. Obviously, the faster than expected potential build out of domestic infrastructure and the country's downstream manufacturing capabilities has a potential to increase this semis consumption total, and also clearly any reduction in the net import position would be beneficial for domestic semi manufacturers as well. So that really concludes my presentation. I would like to say if anyone does have any questions post the presentation, then feel free to contact me and we'll be very glad to keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for such detailed and informative presentation. I would now like to call upon Mr. Shankhadeep Mukherjee, Senior Consultant, CRU International, to deliver his presentation on the aluminium industry. Mr. Mukherjee is based in CRU's Mumbai office and works across the aluminium and steel team and has over 7 years of experience in the metals and mining industry. He has worked in many countries across different functions, including strategy, market research, working capital management, and corporate finance. He has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and an MBA in finance and operations. Please welcome Mr. Shankhadeep with a warm round of applause.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Respected speakers, delegates, and guests. It gives me a great pleasure to be able to be here with you and present our outlook on two of the most important non-ferrous metals, that is copper and aluminium. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Metlex for organizing such a big event and for giving CRE the opportunity in presenting our thoughts in front of such esteemed guests. One of my colleagues, Matthew Anacott, who looks after the copper market, he helped me prepare this presentation. Unfortunately, he could not be here with me, but I will take you through the copper slides as well. So the structure of my presentation today would be, first I would like to introduce briefly CRU to you. Then I would like to get into the aluminium outlook in India. And I will briefly touch upon the scrap market globally and what lessons and what it has in store for India. And I think the secondary market producers and the scrap recyclers would be much more interested in this. I would then go on to the copper outlook for the copper outlook in India and finally conclude with some key takeaways. Now coming to who we are, CRU is a leading independent consulting firm and we provide business analysis, conferences and metals and mining research. So we are basically divided into three divisions. The first division is the analysis division and we have a consulting division as well as a events division. The analysis division is divided into three parts, mostly the steel division, the non-ferrous division and the fertilizers division. And this chart over here gives us the layout of how the copper and the aluminium division is broken out. Paul Williams is the group manager for the aluminium division and Vanessa Davidson, she's the manager for the copper division. Now coming to the presentation at hand, first I would like to show you what are the key factors that would drive the growth of aluminium and copper in the world over. So if you can see, as you can see in this slide, that we expect aluminium to grow faster as compared to the other non-ferrous metals on account of larger substitution. In fact, in the past 5 years, demand for aluminium has grown at a rate of 6.5% as compared to the other non-ferrous metals, which has grown at a rate of 2.5%. And going forward, based on substitution, we expect aluminium will diverge faster as compared to the other non-ferrous metals. Now coming specifically to aluminium, what this chart basically shows the metal balance in the market. So in 2015, what we expected that the primary market was in kind of surplus, but it was mostly concentrated in China and most of the deficit of the rest of the world was largely in deficit. In 2016, we also expect a little bit of surplus, but again that would be in China and deficit to be there in the rest of the world. And going forward, there is in 2017 we expect some sort of a balance between the whole global market, but again the surplus is going to be expected to be in China, and the rest of the world is expected to be in deficit. Now, this is possibly the chart which says it all regarding the growth of aluminium in India. As you can see, China largely covers the entire spectrum, or a significant portion of the demand spectrum. So, what we have on the x-axis over here is the total consumption from each of the regions or the countries specified. And what we have on the y-axis over there is the growth rate expected from each of the regions. So if you want volume, China is the place to be. But if you want growth, India is the place to be. Because even though the bar over there is quite slim, the growth prospects in India from the demand side is significantly high compared to rest of the world and even China. Now, coming specifically to India, we see that the electrical sector and the transport sector would be the most important drivers of growth for aluminium. The first pie chart shows that in 2000 by 2016 what is the expected consumption, end-use consumption, and as I explained, electrical and transport sector is expected to take the lead. In fact, every other day, PGCIL goes on announcement for one new project or other, and I think by August they had announced projects worth of around 30,000 crores to be implemented over the next 36 to 48 months. The 2x2 chart on the other side shows our expectations on the growth rate and the share of market from each of the end-use segments, and you would see that electrical segment and transport segment is expected to have the highest growth rate till 2025, and also by 2025 they will also have the highest share of demand from the aluminium for aluminium. Now, in terms of specific production and demand, the chart shows basically the growth prospects, the production from the primary aluminium producers, the growth rate and the demand. The blue line is the demand, and you'll see it's pretty constant demand of around 7-8% over the period till the next 5 or 6 years. In terms of production, Vedanta has been leading the production right now in terms of commissioning capacities, and they recently commissioned a new pot line in Jharsuguda, and the second pot line is expected to be commissioned very soon. As far as the aluminium order book index is concerned, if you look at the purchasing index, it has been over 50 for the last quite few months, showing that the demand outlook for aluminium in India remains strong. However, this is for the Asia section, and it is heavily weighted by China. In terms of the price forecast, we expect that the price will be trapped in a very tight band, and by 2017, third quarter 2017, that is roughly 1 year from now, we will be having a price of around $1,600 per ton of LME for aluminium. Now, I would like to touch upon the scrap market outlook in India. In terms of the scrap market outlook, things are a bit different. Now, while China leads in the primary aluminium per capita consumption, it lags in the per capita consumption of scrap. However, if you see in this graph, it will show that they are the largest consumer of scrap. So much so, at this point in time, they have to import the scrap. However, we feel that the things are going to change going forward, and that is largely on account of the large investments that China had done in the real estate over the last decade, and the significant growth in automobiles in China over the last decade. So we expect the scrap from transports or the automobile recycled scrap will be available to the market by the 2020s, and the building scraps will start coming into the market by the 2030s or the 2040s. China itself will not be in a position to consume this entire amount of scrap. Similar position is expected to happen in the United States as well as Western Europe, where higher regions, higher scrap is expected to avail. Without any sorting technology, and I say the word sorting technologies because most of the old scrap which is going to come into the market is expected to be uh, casting scrap, which would have some sort of contaminations and will not be in a position to be easily used in rollings or extrusions, unless, because some of the casting scraps are usually contaminated with zinc and iron, they can be used only in castings. So unless some sort of investment is made in the sorting technology this within China, this will come upon and have an impact on the market for India. I would like to now move on to the market outlook for copper in India. Over here, as you will see that the India market is around 6 and 8% growth prospects, and I will touch upon that going forward in the slides. Most probably in the North American market, which is seeing a growth rate of 1.5%, but it is on a higher base, so the percentage might be a little bit misleading. The residential housing demand in the North American market remains positive. Unfortunately, in the South American market, in Brazil, the current economic conditions has led us to downgrade the situation in Brazil. In Western Europe, we are witnessing significant growth of new car sales, which is why the 2.4% number which you see over there. And the Eastern Europe, the decline which you have seen is largely on account of Russian economy being downgraded by us in terms of growth prospects. In India, we have favorable economic conditions, including the current scenario of low oil prices, and that is why we feel that India will be growing at 6 and 8% compared to the world average of 1.3%. The major areas of domestic demand, such as construction, auto, and industrial productions, remain quite strong, and you will see that the comparing this three parameters, the refined copper demand in India is expected to be on similar lines. However, as I mentioned in the very beginning of our presentation, there is a tendency to substitute aluminium for copper, and we feel that the copper prices need to come down to significantly low levels than it is currently as to stop substitutions from happening going forward. In terms, what this graph explains is the growing intensity of copper in India and China. The growth in India, what we have assumed, is on account of per capita growth of human population. It's not a non-linear growth or anything. It's a linear growth based on the growth of population and vehicle sales. In order to have non-linear growth, we need to have further deepening or investment in the manufacturing sector, which will be then put us in a position to grow faster. In the graph over here will be much more steeper than the flattish thing over you say here. The decline in China is largely on account of the manufacturing situation and the cost of manufacturing which is rising in China right now, and that's why we have considered a decline over here. In terms of copper smelting and refining, we feel that it has leveled off, and by 2020, India might be in a position of self-sufficiency for copper. We have some projects such as the Tuticorin project and other projects in our baseline forecast in 2020. However, if those projects do not come up on stream, we might not have this self-sufficiency, and we might be the exporter of cathodes as we are now. This is the copper market pricing outlook that we expect. So right now it is around, by 2017, we expect the market to be in surplus and hence the price to go down a bit. However, going forward by 2020, we expect the market to again be in a deficit, and the price is expected to be around 5,500. So coming to the conclusion, the key takeaways from this presentation. We expect that very good investment opportunities are there in the aluminium across the value chain, not only for the primary producers, also for the secondary producers. Especially the scraps, the sorting technology, which is point number 3, because that is something which is very important, and there should the re-rollers could be in a position to capitalize on that. There is a situation for higher substitution for aluminium, more importantly in automotive segment. Mr. Pai covered it in the morning today that their stringent emission norms are driving substitution overseas and lightweighting. So that is something which will lead to a non-linear growth. It will not be just a percentage per capita increase, it will increase a share of the pie of the aluminium market in the transport sector. As far as copper demand is concerned, in absolute volumes, we think it will be held back on account of preference to aluminium cables, and electrical sector is expected to do very well right now. And without any further investments in copper smelting and refining, we could become a net importer of cathodes by the 2020s. In case you have any further queries on the presentations or on the aluminium market outlook or the copper market outlook, both myself and Matthew's contact details and email IDs are given over here, so please feel free to contact us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mukherjee, for your insightful presentation. I would now request Dr. Biswajit Nag, Associate Professor, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, to give his perspective on the non-ferrous metal industry. Dr. Biswajit Nag is an Associate Professor at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, IIFT, New Delhi. Involved in empirical economic research for more than 16 years, Dr. Nag has completed a number of projects for Government of India and international agencies such as UN, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, WTO, DFID, etc. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Nag.
At the outset, I'd like to thank Sunil especially and Metlex for having me here and also giving me the opportunity to speak on the topic. I've been listening to different presentations since morning, and I have a feeling that I'm an odd man out in the middle of a lot of industrialists and the corporate sector representatives. I have a fear that I might go into a classroom lecture mode. So my biggest challenge is to convince you some of the important things. Here is my presentation, India's trade in non-ferrous metals. So I'd like to remain in the trade arena. So when we talk about PowerPoint presentations, I was thinking that I'm a powerless man. Nonetheless, my presentations might give you some important points. The presentations here is actually a data-heavy and content-heavy presentation. So you may not need to concentrate on all the detailed numbers because maybe from the back you may not be able to understand what the numbers are there, but I'll request Sunil to make the presentations available if anyone is interested. What I'll do is basically focusing on 4 points. Number 1 is basically a few warm-up slides to understand what is happening in the India's trade scenario. I was hearing a lot of concerns about imports is rising, and several presentations also highlighted today. So I tried to understand, might try to go inside the main reasons. Some of the things are well known, but we can try to make it much more research oriented to find out in depth what are the main reasons behind it. Then I'll focus on the exports first. I'll try to drive home one particular logic that because of lack of competitiveness, maybe our imports are rising, but that is also affecting our exports. So I have seen since in the morning, there is not much of talk about exports because everyone is talking about domestic industry because the market is here. But at the same time, a group of, companies may be very much concerned because, imports are rising, which is affecting their business. So I'd like to drive home the logic that that imports and exports are very well linked. And if you are not able to sell in India, we are going to sell outside. So what are the main reasons for that, and how actually we can actually go ahead with it? And I'll just conclude with some of them, the recommendations. My data for this presentation is basically from the UN Comtrade, which is the international trade database. Now let's go to the first slide, where actually we're talking about India's exports and imports of metals. I'm not talking about ores here. So I have highlighted, you can see there are two circles. The circle, the bigger one, is saying that the blue line is crossing the red line. That means since 2010, our imports have started going up. And you can see that the smaller circle, that last 2 years, the gap is actually increasing. Otherwise, the initial 4 years, it was more or less the same. But now the more concern is the exports is falling, though imports are also falling a little bit, but exports are having a big, big dip, which may be because of many reasons, which I'll come there. The next one is about the non-ferrous ores. Here is a clearly, we are importing ores. I'll go into the details, what are those products, and our exports are also going down. What are the top source of imports? If you see that in last few years, our import goods, some are in red color, some are in blue. Now the blue ones are actually the free trade agreement partners. Okay, so since 2010, we have few trade agreements, especially with Asian countries, Japan, Korea. But you need to also understand that there are non-FTA partners also, countries from where our imports are actually being sourced. So on an average, the cumulative growth rate of imports from 2006 to 2015, I've taken a long period, is close to 11.5% from China, whereas you can see it from Malaysia, from Korea, as well as Singapore is rising significantly. I don't know whether you are able to see it, but you can see the color. That's most important. These are various segments of the overall non-ferrous metals. So starting from the aluminum, then copper, nickel, lead, zinc, and tin and other metals. You can see that some countries, these are the list of countries, the top countries from where we are importing. And you can see that there are not many red colors. So that implies the red colors as the FTA partners, because we are actually being concerned that there are a lot of imports coming from the free trade agreement partner, but there are imports coming from other countries as well. So this is the basically important thing, that FTA is not the only culprit. There could be some other countries from where actually our imports are rising. Now what I did is basically to understand which of the products actually are having very high growth. So I went to the detailed trade data analysis, and then I found that some products, the products are in groups, like in copper. You can see that some numbers are actually in red colors. That means they are actually having very high growth, as well as very high volume. For example, copper ware, copper, unrefined copper, and then you can find out that in case of nickel, unwrought nickel. So these are having very high numbers in last year, as well as a very high double-digit growth rate. In case of aluminum, aluminum plates, aluminum foil, bars, unwrought aluminum, these are actually giving us a high growth. So it is a very technical slide, but let me just explain. And there are quite a few such slides, but let us try to understand what is happening in the free trade agreement, because why people are so much concerned about it. So if you look at the first column is the serial number, second column is the product. This is a slide for aluminum. And there are the codes, which is the trade codes, and the current effective duty, which is 5%. Rest of the right-hand side, all the columns are the current duties on the on aluminum products coming from different free trade agreement members. And you can also find out in some cases it is written EL, that means exclusions list. If the product is in exclusion list, that product does not enjoy the benefit of free trade agreement. So you can find out that Malaysia, the duty is 0. For South Asia, doesn't matter whether the duty is 0. For Japan, it is 4.1, whereas the MFN, which is the actual duty, unilaterally what India charges is 5%. So duty from Japan, Malaysia, and the overall ASEAN members as a whole is much, much lower than this. So this is basically giving you a tendency that there is a possibility of a trade diversions. I'm coming to that. So the reason of the overall rise in import, what I think and what I have gathered from the literature as well as in my own research, that there could be 3 possible reasons. One is, which we are actually listening since morning, there is a huge rise in demand in India. India is in the growth path, so of course, the demand will be very high. But people are not looking at the demand part, that India is a big country, it is growing, very high speed and it will be. So people are actually looking on jumping into the right one, which is the FTA, Free Trade Agreement. But apart from that, there could be one more reason, which is in the middle, that many countries, especially China, is having now huge capacity, which is actually suppressing the world price. So there is a possible price advantage, even they are not engaged in any free trade agreement with India. So tariffs, which is a 5% or 4%, 3% doesn't make much difference. Because anyway, they have huge capacity, they have reduced the price. And also the economic literature says that there is a possibility of a tariff jumping in case of a big country. If the importing country is a big country, then sometimes tariff cannot be an effective barrier because there will be an investment R&D to reduce the price in the source countries so that in the small tariff they can jump it and can engage and start exporting it. So what will happen because of these 3 possible reasons? First is, if India is not improving itself in terms of competitiveness, when there is a high growth, the space for the domestic companies will gradually shrink. So more and more imports will come. Second, when there is an FTA with a set of countries, what actually people are doing, and in this case many researchers are also getting into a kind of a misleading path, that there's a lot of import from Singapore, there's a lot of import from Malaysia. It could be a case of trade diversions because the duty has come down on these countries. So otherwise, the import would have come from a third country on which the duty is higher. So the third country is actually setting up some kind of an establishment in these countries and trying to divert the export. So it is not a new import which is generated, it is basically diverting the import. For example, say Singapore, we saw a 22% share, but Singapore doesn't produce anything. So a lot of Chinese, Malaysian and Indonesian company may be diverting the trade through Singapore. There is also a case of a duty inversion, which I think industry has highlighted to the ministry, and in last budget there is a lot of discussion on the duty inversion. What does it mean? Duty inversion, generally when you try to give protections to a particular industry, then it's always like a very low duty on the raw materials and relatively higher duty on the intermediary goods, and final goods there will be higher duty. But if it is opposite, then what will happen? The raw material and the intermediate goods, if the duty is higher, and the final good, the duty is low, then the final good does not enjoy the protection. So in this case, the domestic industry development has actually become very much affected by this kind of a wrong structure of the duty. A very good example is the failure of India's electronic industry. Whereas the chips and components can be imported at a higher duty, while a mobile phone can be imported at a lower duty. As a result of that, domestic mobile phone industry has not been developed, but recently it has been corrected, and that's why we'll find that a lot of new mobile companies will be coming up. Quickly coming to the exports, again some slides somehow got missed. So we can see the story is little more sad. The sense that we don't find many blue numbers here. What is happening? We have free trade agreement, so there is a market, but only Malaysia and Korea are actually among the top 10 exporting destinations. Whereas, Mexico is another important destination, so the growth rate is higher. What I have done, this is a technical part, I'm not going into that. What I have done, something called revealed comparative advantage to understand the India's strength. Okay, this is a technical term. I do not want the audience to understand it much, but generally, if the number is more than 1, we consider that particular product is actually having a high possibility of having a growth. So this is my free consultancy, actually. So I have identified these are the products in which India enjoys the competitive advantage. Whether we are able to exploit that competitive advantage, that I say 50-50, responsibility lies with the industry, responsibility lies with the government as well. If you do not have a good policies to promote those sectors, then actually we will not be able to do much. But there exists a lot of potentiality. Recently, as an economic researcher, as we follow a lot of methodologies recently on the trade, World Bank has recently brought out a proxy methodology for understanding the quality of the trade. Now, as you can understand, trades are just numbers and the volumes. We cannot understand the quality of the product. So, as an industrialist, you will be able to understand the quality of the product on a technical term, but for an economist, it's just looking at the number is very difficult. So what we try to do, we try to understand this particular thing, that the change of price, the product's average price, the way we are exporting, and the change of the market share. So that means there is a possibility of 4 possibilities. In one case, our export price is rising, but in the destination countries, our market share also rising. So that's a very good story that indicates that value of the products are such that there is a market is not dying. There could be the opposite case, that when there's a decrease in competitiveness, that means as our prices become costly, if we are really uncompetitive, our technology is not good, even our cost of doing business, if it is not good, then our product price will go up in the export market and we lose the market. So that means that particular market is very competitive. And there are 2 other possibilities as well. So what I have done, the products in which India enjoys the comparative advantage, so I have put them into 2 by 2 kind of a situation. So here what I have done, the right-hand side, this is the first quadrant, is basically rising quality. So on the horizontal axis, the export share is rising. On the vertical axis, there is a price which is also changing in a positive direction. So there are products in which our prices are rising, and the same products in the destination market, our market share is also rising. So these are the sectors actually we must focus. Now if you look at the dots on this particular 2 by 2 diagrams, you will find out large concentrations on the first quadrant. Okay, so even when I was just working for Sunil for this presentation, it was a big surprise because there exists a lot of potentiality. We are not exploiting that potentiality. Secondly, you also find there are quite a few numbers on this particular part where there is an economies of scale. That means price is coming down, we have improved our competitiveness, and in the export market, our market share is also rising. A very natural thing is a volume based, which China always does. So this is the first important thing. We can identify these numbers, and if anyone wants to, I have given in the next few slides, but for the paucity of time, I will not go into the detail, but each of those points can be identified, and if any of the producers are here, are actually producing those commodities, must exploit the international market. My second suggestion, which is to the industry associations as well as to the government, I have highlighted a lot of products which are just around the origin. Okay, that means these products are just on the threshold. These products are just on the threshold. These products require certain backing. How you are going to back, we require more in-depth analysis. And as you can see, these products are actually in large in numbers. So I have given the list of those products so that anyone can actually take it further. So towards the end, So what the story is coming out of these two parts, one is the import and the export. The rise in imports are because of three reasons. It's not just free trade agreement. So you really, and I personally believe that even rising the import duty a little bit, we will not be able to control the import much because India is on the growing path. And Indian industry is not producing sufficiently for our own country. So the cheaper products are there. The world is open. And politically also, internationally, we cannot just increase the trade barrier further. We are a member of WTO. So every small thing we'll be doing, we need to justify these things in the international forum. So it will be very difficult. So let's focus on the long-term competitiveness. Okay? When you are looking at the long-term competitiveness, there's a lot of discussions in the first session or session 0, inaugurations. Those are basically business environment-related, environment-related problem, which is infrastructure. We talked about land. We talked about electricity. There are other issues like complicated taxations. There are other issues like, financing. There's a lot of discussion on it. So this is one side story. I'm not going into that. I think there are a lot of deliberations, industry continuously making it. What I'm trying to say that you need to see the sector holistically. Don't see the sector for protecting the import only. You also need to develop export capacity. And to develop the export capacity, in the time of globalization, your import is very, very responsible. If you are getting a cheaper import, but you are able to generate more revenue by exporting, then you must do it. And that also helps the domestic industry to come up with a high competitiveness. And this should be our long-term possibility. So, 3 possibilities I thought of: short run, medium run, and the long run. The short run, it's very contentious. Steel sector is doing it. There's steel quality control order, which is basically trying to impose a minimum import price. If you really, really would like to control the import. But we need to be very careful because many of them are not WTO compatible also. So we might get into some kind of an international litigations. But what I'm saying, that try it for a couple of months if industry is really in bad positions. In the second stage, definitely you can think of quality standards. You are making a lot of products. A lot of final products also start coming. Also, you can think of some qualities. There are Indian standards. There are compulsory registrations. There are a whole lot of things for the standards. You require ISI marks. So you can explore that particular possibility. But the third one, no one can challenge, is basically about the competitiveness. In many sectors, the competitiveness have been developed through a concept called local content requirement. That when you are actually making the final product, some percentage of that, and you need to have a path that I will make that percentage to 0 in 5 years' time. So if you think that now that 20% need to be procured domestically, and you will be compensated when you are actually exporting it further. So there could be a set-off policy, because if you are really like to use the domestic components, and if you are exporting, you are getting an extra benefits for it. So that could be a set-off policy to help both primary recycling and the secondary set. So this kind of a, when Sunil talked about the ecosystem, so we need to talk about both sides. The last one, I'd like to coin this particular term. This is the time of global value chain. Okay, you really, if you just open up your mobile phone, you really can't say where it is made. Can you? You can't. The battery is made in China, your chip is maybe in Taiwan, maybe the technology is coming from Japan, so you really can't. In future, you also will not be able to do it. All industry will be going in the same directions. What happened in our industrial development policy in last 60 years, we have taken a particular path called import substitution. And that's why our mindset is always in the import substitution structure. Whereas Japan and Korea developed a concept called fragmentation, agglomerations, and internationalizations. Japan government will give you the concessions, give you the incentive if in the R&D process you are able to fragment the productions in such a way that the SMEs are getting the benefits. So it is the responsibility of the large industrial houses that when you are doing an R&D, going into the downstream, how much actually you are fragmenting, not agglomerating. So Japan gives a very, very huge incentive. Think of Casio as a big company. Okay, the second is, once you are fragmenting, then you are creating industrial zone like SEZs. There actually you are making something called agglomeration. So there will be 20 such small producers, 100 small producers in this particular zone. So this is agglomerations. Thirdly, internationalization. Industrialization is not successful unless it is internationalized. We always look at the back, our own domestic market, but you must also look at the international market. Towards these directions, I would like to add one particular terminology, which I am using in public lecture in last few months, to make our Make in India successful. Like the global value chain, we must think of interstate value chain. Currently what is happening, all the states have started giving incentives. So in my understanding, it's a race to the bottom. Now what will happen? Suppose Maharashtra is giving some incentives, Karnataka will also give some incentives tomorrow. So will you shift your setup from Maharashtra to Karnataka? So this will not go anywhere. You need to understand the overall the industry ecosystems in a interstate value chain concepts. There are mines, there are primary sectors, there are secondary sectors, there are ports, there are markets. So we need to link them. GST is a very welcome approach in this case, but there are long ways to go. You have interstate many, many differences. Our infrastructures, logistics are not similar. So one of the most important component is should not be interstate competition. There should be collaborations among the states also to make any particular sector successful. I'd like to finish it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nag, for your presentation. I now request Chief Executive Officer for Copper at Vedanta Limited, Shri P. Ramnath, to join us on stage and address this August gathering. Mr. P. Ramnath is the Chief Executive Officer at Vedant's Copper business in Tuticorin, Corinne, Silvassa, and Fujairah, UAE. Prior to joining Vedanta in September 2011, he was the Chief Operating Officer of JK Paper Limited. He has over 30 years of experience across sectors of chemicals, specialty chemicals, manufacturing and paper industries at Jubilant Life Sciences Limited, Praxair India, SNF Ion Exchange, Bakelite Hylam Limited, and Reliance Industries Limited. Please welcome Mr. P. Ramnath along with Mr. Sunil Madhya.
A very good afternoon to all of you. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Mr. Sunil Madhya for organizing such an excellent event for the World Non-Ferrous Metals Conference. I would like to congratulate him for inviting so many notable personalities from across the various industries, as well as government. I would look forward to many such conferences in the future, which gives an opportunity for the various people in the primary as well as the secondary markets to meet each other and exchange ideas. I have listened with interest with the various presentations which were done, and I note the various. I note with with a lot of enthusiasm the kind of confidence which is placed in the Indian market, and I fully agree that the Indian market is really poised to take off. in the copper. I'm talking about the copper segment because I represent the copper business in Vedanta. If I just take you through the overall industry from an industry perspective, the overall demand, overall supply of copper, the total installed capacity of copper in India for primary copper is a shade below 1 million tons per annum. The major players are, of course, Hindalco, then that is us, there's Vedanta, then Hindustan Copper, the public sector unit. And the total demand for primary copper in India is currently a little above 650,000 tons per annum. And so if you see, the domestic manufacturer are fully capable in terms of the capacity to feed the domestic demand of 650,000 tons per annum. And this demand, though about 3 years ago it was mostly flat at roughly around 1 to 2% per annum, over the last 2 years it has really burgeoned. It has seen a huge demand increase of roughly about 10 to 12% per annum. And we are very, very bullish, and given the kind of impetus that the government is giving for manufacturing and opened up various sectors like defense, etc. And a lot of renewable energy is also planned. So we have absolutely no doubt that the demand for copper in India is going to be at a very high level. As you know, copper is also called Dr. Copper because basically it is a bellwether for the status of the industry, for the growth of the industry. It shows the status of how well the economy is doing. And the growth of copper is very, very much linked to the GDP. So we expect that definitely, as was pointed out in one of the presentations, roughly about 7% per annum. So definitely, I'm sure that that is the long-term growth which will definitely that we will see, and probably in the short term, much more growth. So talking about the growth of copper demand in India, as I was saying, that the domestic industry is fully capable of fulfilling the demand in India of 650,000. What we see here is an anomaly. On the one hand, we have imports which are coming in, partly due to FTAs, partly due to other reasons. So imports are roughly coming in around 1/3 of the total demand. So I think last year it was just a shade above 200,000. This year probably the total imports will be 250,000 tons per annum. And imports from FTAs, through FTAs have been roughly about 50 to 60,000 tons per annum. And then we have imports from other countries like Russia and Middle East, and of course there are imports from IT sector imports which come in at concessional duty. So all these put together about 200,000 last year, this year about 250,000. And on the other hand, we also are exporting copper. Both Hindalco and us, both of us export roughly about 50% of our production. So roughly around, say maybe over 350,000 tons per annum of copper is exported. And we are exporting roughly around $2 billion per annum of exports. So this is a huge anomaly that we see here. And our primary goal is to meet the domestic demand. Like for example, every month we fulfill the entire domestic demand and then only talk about exporting. So that's the domestic market is our primary market. So this is something which we have brought to the notice of the government, because as in the previous presentation also we were talking about inverted duty. So here definitely there is a case of inverted duty whereby we are importing the copper concentrate at 2.5% duty, whereas in the FTAs, we have the duties which are going to be 0% from ASEAN from January 2017 onwards. And from Japan also it is on a reduction trend. So there is this case of inverted duties, which we have to address, which is something, which we have been trying to bring the focus of the government, so that, we don't have the issue. I think we should make use of this Make in India impetus, so that, there's a sort of an anomaly out there. On the one hand, we have the government talking about Make in India, but on the other hand, of course, we have FTAs. Of course, I'm not saying that the government definitely has a pressure of making the world totally flat. And in terms of competitiveness, definitely the domestic industry is doing its utmost in benchmarking with the world's best smelters, the world's best copper rod producers, in order to produce the best quality at the best price. So that is something which we continuously do on a continuous basis. And it is the primary copper producers associations promise that definitely in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, in terms of the cost competitiveness, definitely I think we will be, we'll strive to be the world's best. So these are the issues that the copper, domestic copper industry is facing right now. Also, I think please keep in mind that in comparison to the smelters abroad, we have a number of disadvantages. For example, in terms of working capital finance, this industry is hugely dependent on working capital. We have working capital demands of roughly around nearly about 10 to 15,000 crores, which we need, for the import of the copper concentrate. So this is a huge amount that needs to be serviced at the kind of interest rates that we have here domestically versus the interest rates that are prevailing for the smelters abroad. Like, for example, Japanese smelters are probably getting it at negative interest. And the other thing is that a lot of these smelters abroad have tie-ups with various mines from where they get preferential treatment for sourcing. So that is another disadvantage. The one more disadvantage is that the freight to India, we have to pay a freight differential vis-a-vis the freight which is there for Japan or China. So there again, we are at a big disadvantage. So all these items put together, it results in our cost, moving up, which we have tried to counter by, making our operations much more efficient, as much efficient as possible. And I am proud to say that at least in Vedanta, I would say that we are, in terms of various parameters, we are among the top 3 smelters in the world. As we said, we keep benchmarking ourselves throughout the world. We keep sending our people to various smelters, and then we try to learn what is the best that they are doing and try to incorporate it in our own smelting business. So this is the status that we have right now. So the main issues, as I said, number one is the FTAs, which account for about 1/3 of the imports. We are also looking forward to the government, doing something on the copper concentrate, so that, we are whatever the disadvantage that we have of inverted duty is set right. And we are also looking forward to the government giving an incentive, or rather reinstating the incentive of 2%, which was there prior to March 2015. So this 2% incentive was something which was making us competitive in the world market. So this has, since 2015 been discontinued. So this is one thing, this is again one more thing that we are, representing to the government, so that, we become more and more competitive. And as you know, the China trade balance has been negative. It was roughly around, I think, 45 to 50 billion. Now this gap is increasing on a year-to-year basis. And out of the total, out of total exports to China, almost 20% is constituted by copper. So that is another reason, by which we are looking forward to some kind of support from the government. And I'm sure that our pleas will certainly be heeded and will be given the necessary, succor, so that we come out and we are able to perform in a much better manner and compete in the world market. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your informative speech. I would now like to call upon Mr. Sunil Mardia to felicitate the speakers for the session, starting with Mr. P. Ramnath, CEO, Vedanta Copper. A big round of applause, please. Please welcome once again Mr. Rob Smith. Mr. Shankhadeep Mukherjee, Senior Consultant, CRU International. Dr. Biswajit Nag, Associate Professor, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. I would like to call upon someone to represent ME Global, Mr. Ashok Jain. Vedanta is also the sponsor for the evening, and the felicitation has been offered to Mr. P. Ramnath. Before we close this session, I would like to call Mr. Ru on stage once again.
I'll take 2 minutes on what Mr. Ramnath said. I mean, we definitely and fully agree with what he's trying to say, that there are some inverse duty structure, cost of capital, high freight, and other things which are the impediments to the growth of the non-ferrous metal industry. And I think that is the same points were raised by even Mr. Pai in the earlier session. And that is what the whole non-ferrous conference is about. And I would just like to tell him that we are trying to come up with a paper once we end the conference about what the primary, secondary, end users and the recycling industries should do together and make a presentation to the government, or have a next round of meeting in next 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks time, whereby we give a collaborative approach or collaborative presentation to the government. That's what I would like to say. Thank you so much.
I'm in that terrifying position now where my speech is between you and your lunch. I shall therefore be quick. I actually took more notes in that last session than I did in many of my lectures at university. Let me pick up on a couple of points that were made in those talks there. A very important point. Our primary goal is to meet the domestic market because of the potential of that market. You're on the verge of massive infrastructure growth. That is the fastest driver of GDP. Massive growth in vehicle ownership, massive demand for home comforts. All of these things drive GDP growth. India has the potential to replace imports with domestic production. You have the potential to replace imported energy with domestic production. And then the potential to drive export, if only you could sort the internal issues. Quoting Shankhadeep here, lots of upsides, but we just need to be able to capitalize. In the 3 stages of Buddha, also invented in India, perfect what goes on the inside, then perfect the actions, and then share with the world. Sharing with the world. So what it would appear to me to be would, if India is to be a fantastic global player, the first thing we have to do is behave and look like a fantastic global player. That means sorting out all these issues before we can play the same game as the wonderful outside world. Has the wonderful outside world really got it right? I can sit on a train in London with my mobile phone and send a video on YouTube of some amusing kitten sitting on a roller skate to 1 million people around the world. While I sit on a train that hasn't changed in the last 50 years, running on rails that have been there for 150 years, sitting on a network that's still driven by burning fossil fuel. Has really the rest of the world got everything right? Have we really been all that clever? We talked about the substitution of aluminium to copper in overhead cables. Well, yeah, sure, because we realised that we didn't have it right. What's the point of making overhead cables out of copper? Aluminium is 3.5 times stronger for long-distance cables. And when you're transmitting electricity at high voltage, low current, you don't need copper's conductivity. So why put it up there? This substitution is exactly what we said about the global megatrends. Engineers will choose the right material for the job. And now we're realizing in the rest of the world that we got a lot of things wrong. We're polluting the atmosphere too much. We've chosen the wrong metals for energy distribution. We're moving to electrical cars. The potential to do things right is huge. Yes, sir?
Those might have been fixed when copper was only $1,500.
Yeah, but to change from one position to another position, of course, takes that period of pain, and no one wanted to go through the pain. But now we're in a period in the world where we have to face that pain. We have to face that pain. So now we've been told off about all the things that India needs to get right. India, you've got the chance now to do all those things that the rest of the world didn't, to generate your power cleanly, to choose the right metal, to build your cars properly, to look not at all the wonderful things that we might have done right, but all the things we did wrong. That would make India a shining light to the rest of the world. And I think this is a country that's destined to lead the world for getting those things right. Why? Ambition. Ambition to learn and grow, as we see in every school child. The ambition to speak the world's language, to be online. We talked about virtual metal. As the rest of the world becomes increasingly more nationalist, as we see in the Brexit elections and whatever's going on with Donald Trump, here's a country that's opening its arms and embracing the rest of the world. And here's a country that still has enough spirituality to look out at infinity and say, yes, maybe. So I started this morning by saying flavors of yesterday. What do I think the flavor of tomorrow is? I think made in India. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your lunch.